pleasure to be back here, although I guess I'm not really back because I've never been here before. We've been downstairs in the past, haven't I? Thank you for having me here and us here. It's a pleasure to be here again. And today's topic is presidential politics and campaigning. As a caveat here, before we get into this, I want to confirm and warn you that we're not going to really talk about in-depth political issues as such. This is not a debate. If you want to watch the debate, I guess you can wait till the television debates start on September 26th, if they take place. But this isn't a debate, but it is a discussion with two really kind of, I won't say they're insiders, I'm not sure they'd like that phrase, insiders, but people who are knowledgeable about the political process and campaigning and the like, and we're privileged to have them here. And they're going to talk a little bit about their perspectives on politics and campaigning and this presidential campaign and some of the procedures and strategies that candidates use, because they've both been there and been involved in these kind of matters. And we'll go back and forth a little bit, and I'll moderate and ask them some questions. And I'm seated in the middle here to keep them from getting at each other here if things get a little bit hot and heavy. And then, of course, we'll have questions and answers from, at least questions and maybe some answers from those in attendance here. So I think you'll find this enjoyable. It's certainly a timely topic and a hot topic for a hot day. So let me introduce our participants. First of all, both of these gentlemen happen to be my friends, and I hope they stay my friends after we're done here. To my right and on my right and on the conservative side of things is Scott Johnson. Scott is a very prominent, well-known, skillful lawyer here in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities area. And Scott perhaps is best known publicly as a well-known blogger. In fact, the name that's often used before Scott, when Scott's introduced or when he appears in the media, which is often, it's usually conservative blogger, Scott Johnson. We'll ask him about whether that's an accurate title, but his Powerline blog has been a prominent feature in the social media, not just this year, but in previous years. So Scott has broken a lot of significant, important stories as an investigative, I won't say reporter, but investigative blogger. And Scott will talk about his work in that area from the conservative standpoint. On my left, rightfully so, or leftly so, I guess, but rightfully so on my left is from the left side of the political spectrum, Jorge Saavedra. Jorge is also a longtime friend of mine and an attorney, and a well-known attorney and a very prominent attorney who practices in different disciplines here in the Twin Cities area. Jorge has been involved in the Hillary Clinton campaign and in other campaigns, done a lot of voter organization and voter turnout, and he'll talk about some of the kind of inside aspects of getting people to the polls and what motivates people and what doesn't, and some of those tactics and techniques. So I think you'll find this interesting and informative and educational and maybe even a little bit fun too, okay? So let me start out by asking you, Scott, to just introduce yourself a little bit more than I have and tell us a little about what you do and what you don't do and your perspective on what's going on these days politically.
Well, thanks, Marshall. Thanks for the kind words. Should I stand up while I give this answer, or do you want me to sit down? Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Johnson. I am originally from St. Paul, live over in that neck of the woods, and am a friend of Marshall's. I'm here because he asked me to. If he asks me my name and background, that may be the only question I'm capable of answering today. I do want to explain a little bit about why he asked me here, what brings me here today. I practiced law for 35 years and began writing op-ed columns and magazine articles in the pre-internet era on the side of our law practice with one of my law partners, John Hinderacher, in early 1992. And we had a lot of success getting articles published and had a lot of fun seeing them in print. And went more or less from strength to strength, getting articles published in the Pioneer Press, the Star Tribune. We were ecstatic when National Review accepted one of our articles on George Bush's tax return. I could talk about what kept us going those first few years, but it was really fun and interesting, and on the side of our law practice, it was a great outlet for us. After 9/11, when the internet kind of took off, John was really interested in the online phenomenon as an outlet for us. We had been publishing everything that we did with joint bylines by John Hinderacher and Scott Johnson. So we published a lot of stuff because it was the two of us writing together. Over Memorial Day weekend 2002, John called me up and said he'd set up this site on free blogger software that one of his kids' friends had suggested that we name Powerline. And he asked me to start contributing to it the way I had to the articles that we had been writing jointly together. And of the two of us, John really was the brain power, and I had put most of my effort into thinking about what we could write for publications, being outside the journalistic fraternity, where we could write material that would get published, that would be of interest to editors at the various publications. But the online platform was just a whole new world for us, and it freed, I appreciated the freedom, the editorial freedom to write about what we were interested in, to get information out there, and to do so immediately without worrying about pleasing editors. The only problem was our only readers for a while were our immediate family on a good day. So that was a challenge all by itself, but as one thing led to another, we started writing the site jointly in 2000, after Memorial Day 2002. As we got a few hundred readers, we invited a third one of us, John's former college debate partner, Paul Mierengoff, who was a DC attorney, to join us. And over the past few years, we asked a fourth contributor, Steve Hayward, I would say a prominent historian who in a rightly ordered world would be teaching American history at Harvard University. He's the author of a 2-volume history of the Reagan era called The Age of Reagan, which is just an excellent piece of work among 6 other books. And Steve joined us a few years ago, and we have kept going online for nearly the past 15 years and writing from a conservative perspective about politics and public policy. And I think that's why Marshall invited me here today. I will say I had my 15 moments of fame. This may be of interest. In 2004, when I started writing about the story that CBS 60 Minutes had broadcast on September 8th, 2004, allegedly exposing President Bush's Texas Air National Guard service as somehow dishonorable. I started writing about that in a post called the 61st Minute at 7:50 a.m. on the morning of September 9th, 2004. And as a result of information that was sent to us at Powerline and that I kept updating that post with, by about 1 o'clock that afternoon, it was apparent, I would say, that the story that CBS had broadcast on the evening before, on September 8th, 2004, was based on fabricated documents and really was one of the great media scandals of all time. And for the next 12 days, while CBS denied the story and tried to figure out what to do, and Dan Rather issued an on-air apology 12 days later with one hand behind his back and fingers crossed. It was just a huge story. There was a constant procession of media people coming in and asking me about what had happened. And all of a sudden, our site, which had a few thousand readers in 2004, had as many as 50 or 100,000 readers in the fall of 2004, and that's basically where we are now. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Scott, and we'll be returning to some of those topics in a few moments. So, Jorge, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here and what you're doing this summer and fall relative to presidential politics.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you, John, and thanks to all of you for having us here this morning. Well, you know, my involvement in politics really starts with my personal history as an immigrant. I credit Henry Kissinger with 2 things. One of them is he gave me and my family a backhanded invitation to the United States when he sponsored the military overthrow of the Chilean government in 1973, and my family came to the United States shortly after, and then he's one of the reasons why I'm a Democrat. But my family came to the United States in the early 1970s, and some of my first experiences in sort of public policy and government and politics was when I was Boy State Governor in 1983, and went to Boys Nation in Washington, D.C., and got to wave at Ronald Reagan as he boarded a helicopter. But I came back from that experience really inspired. And then in 1992, I became a U.S. citizen and got to vote for Bill Clinton in my the first time that I voted, and then started getting involved in campaigns in 2004 in the John Kerry campaign. Then I worked on a number of state and local campaigns, most notably Mark Ritchie's bid for Secretary of State. And then more recently, I've been working specifically with Latina women candidates. And in the last few cycles, I've worked with Melissa Franson, who is now the first Latina senator in Senate District 49, Edina Bloomington, a little bit of Minnetonka, and a little bit of Eden Prairie. And then I also worked with Alondra Cano, who was the first Latina ever elected to the Minneapolis City Council in 2013. And then in 2014, I think it was, I worked with Iris Altamirano, who was a candidate for the Minneapolis School Board. In this election cycle, I've been active in the Democratic Party. I ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic National Committee, but it was an amazing experience because, that's a kind of an inside party campaign. And I had a chance to travel to all of the congressional district conventions, all 8 congressional districts around the state on my campaign, and it was really inspiring and interesting to see how our Democratic Party works across the state of Minnesota. And then, as Marshall says, I'm supporting Hillary and also supporting Melissa Franson and a couple of other local candidates in Melissa is in her re-election bid now. She's coming up on her first re-election here in 2016, along with the rest of the legislature. I've also done a fair amount of nonpartisan, primarily voter participation work. And that's been here in Minnesota within the Latino community, promoting voting and citizenship within the Latino community, and then also statewide with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, where I worked for a time on their nonpartisan voter engagement program across the state of Minnesota. And then I worked with a couple of other folks out of Boston who, most notably George Pillsbury from the Pillsbury family here in Minnesota, on the nonprofit voter engagement network, where we had nonpartisan voter participation projects in 11 states around the country. And really interesting, again, just to see how voting and politics works on the ground across the United States. Some of those dynamics have changed, but so much of that still remains the same.
Thank you both. As 3 lawyers up here, I guess we're always used to standing up when we speak, at least when we're addressing a tribunal, and I guess it's innate in us to stand up when you talk. It has been said, or to paraphrase Donald Trump, many people have said that liberals and liberal ideas were sort of capturing and dominating the social media in the past. That seems to have changed in the last year or so, and we're seeing a proliferation during this presidential campaign of the use of social media and tweeting and all of that stuff as a major player and a major factor in the presidential campaign and other campaigns and political issues as well. And it seems to be more dominated by the conservative wing, with different voices from the conservative wing. That's my observation, Scott, but as a genuine person who really knows about this, tell us a little bit about that perspective.
Well, my exposure is, I'm sorry to say, a little bit limited in that respect. As a contributor at Powerline, we're inundated with emails from campaigns, and get them both from Donald Trump and from the Clinton campaign. I think back to a little bit of what's been written about the election of 2012. I think Barack Obama had the most sophisticated media, online, social media, turnout-driven campaign in our history, and plenty of money to fund it. I think that the same applies to Mrs. Clinton this year. One of the retrospectives on the 2012 campaign noted that the folks running the campaign in the war room at Obama campaign headquarters even got the subject headings of solicitations, email solicitations, down to a science. They tested many to see which was the most lucrative subject heading when they asked for money by email. And of course, that's a big deal now, because unlike, you know, the paid mailings of old, now you can send out email roughly for free, the only cost being the acquisition of email addresses. And we used to get emails from the Obama campaign addressed Dear Hind, H-I-N-D. I'm not sure why, but it was certainly directed at John Hinderaker. I'm not sure where they got Hind. Maybe they thought that was his nickname or his first name, and a shorthand, intimate way of referring to him. They solicited us regularly, at least on a daily, sometimes several times a day basis, for, I would say, $5. And they found that the most lucrative subject heading, I can't give you all of them, but I wonder if you might be willing to take a guess what it was, according to the retrospectives. And it's really a sign of the times. The most lucrative email solicitation subject heading was Hey, H-E-Y, a real intellectual greeting for you know, the crowd that it was aimed at. And this year, from the Clinton campaign, we get at least once a day an email solicitation addressed Dear Rachel, spelled R-A-C-H-E-L-L-E. I don't even know anybody, Rachel, whose name is spelled R-A-C-H-E-L-L-E, and asking us on an emergency basis for $1. So they certainly have our niche correctly pegged. But if we had a buck to give, it wouldn't be to that side of the aisle. So I find that interesting. It seems to me they haven't got it quite as perfected as the Obama folks in 2012, but it's obviously a huge part of their campaign. Mrs. Clinton's biggest problem is where to spend the $1 billion she's going to raise, or the $500 million that she has already raised, according to Politico yesterday.
One of my good friends, who used to be an attorney at the firm that Scott formerly worked for, his daughter was involved in the 2012 Obama campaign as an insider, and this isn't inside information, but she was talking to me during the throes of the campaign and showing me how they were able to, with all these computers and models and everything, they were basically able to zone in, or laser in, to just about every prospective voter. They had information on just about everybody, almost like a consumer marketer, where Target or Best Buy would have drooled to have that kind of information. They had information on the people they wanted to turn out. They knew where they lived, the apartment number, and whether they voted in the last 2 or 3 elections, and how to get them to the polls. And it was like, as I said, a consumer marketing operation. And as you may recall, in the 2012 campaign, the polls were pretty close. They were 2 or 3 point margins, and it looked like a close election. It was a relatively close election, but it was pretty close. It could have gone either way. And David, what's his name? The Obama head. No, David Plouffe was the head guy, but the guy was on TV a lot. Yeah, Axelrod was on a lot of the TV shows talking about, well, it's close, he said, but we have the ground game. Remember that phrase, ground game? It really first appeared, I think, in 2004 with Karl Rove and Bush and getting that Ohio vote to come in, which turned that election. But at any rate, he said, don't worry, but we have the ground game, and we're going to show you that we're going to be able to get everyone we wanted. And by gosh, I think the Obama people, whether you're for them or against them, just about turned out every voter they could find. I mean, they just got everybody there to the polls, and it was obviously effective, and it ultimately resulted in whatever is a 4 or 5 point voting differential. But that's so important, and as I understand, the Clinton people are essentially using the same people and the same techniques, and the Trump people, as we've all heard and read, have nothing like that apparently going on. And that may be, it's beneath the surface, but it may be a big difference on election day or even pre-election day, because as you know, there's early voting that starts pretty soon. Minnesota is the first early voting state. I think Minnesota and South Dakota start on September 23rd. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about voter turnout and organization. You've done that kind of work, Jorge. What does it take to turn out voters? And I take it there's probably some different mechanisms that are perhaps more effective at the Democratic end, dealing with more people who are more inclined to vote Democratic, than it might be at the Republican or conservative end.
Well, just some really interesting comments here from the panel in terms of, some things that I definitely get my attention. One of them is, if you ask a lot of new voters how they communicate, email might be one of the last things that they say. And in fact, I would suggest to you that there's new voters in this election that don't really know what email is, and they've never had an email account. And so it's interesting that, this is still a big part of what campaigns are doing in terms of email, but social media has moved so rapidly. I think President Obama was the first president to have his own cell phone as a president, and I know that there was a lot of controversy about security and all these other issues when he wanted to hang on to his cell phone when he became president. I think President Obama was also the first president to have a Twitter account. And now we have a presidential candidate whose campaign is, Twitter is, I would suggest, the primary communication tool for candidate Trump in this election. And so it's really interesting to hear how quickly this has changed, and I think that it's going to continue to change, especially for young people. I started my career after college in retail, and so the ground game that Marshall's talking about really was invented by retailers, by people who wanted to sell you things, and campaigns are really no different. Let me ask you guys a question. Can you raise your hand if in the last 4 years since the 2012 election, and before that, leading up to the 2012 election, how many of you have been door knocked by either a candidate or a political campaign? How many people have had somebody come to your house? Okay, I'll say that's maybe a little bit less than half, about half of the room that said yes. And as much as social media is important, as much as the internet and email and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and all these things are important, I would suggest to you that the thing that still makes successful campaigns is having a really solid door knock plan.
The big difference in that is, are they local candidates or national?
Well,
Why don't you just for the question that was asked, and we'd kind of like you to keep your questions for the end, but we'll get to the questions because it's okay. You can stay in the room. The question was, and I was thinking the same thing, in terms of door knocking, is that effective more so with local candidates, city council, legislatures, state representatives, and senators, compared to perhaps the higher level candidates, governor, senator, and of course, president? It's a good question, and I'd also throw in with that lawn signs too, another form of kind of retail politics. It's been said that this year there are fewer lawn signs than ever for the presidential candidates. There weren't that many back in 2012, and one reason it has been said is because of the volatility of this campaign and the strong feelings. People are afraid to put signs on their lawn because they're afraid of someone doing some harm to them on either side of the spectrum. So what about that? Is the door knocking, the lawn signs, the old-fashioned way?
Well, that's door knocking is inexpensive. And so it still remains, I think, the bread and butter for local candidates, legislative candidates, city council, and so on. Although in Minnesota we have a great tradition of having very strong statewide door knock campaigns, and then frequently we'll have crossover, especially in the closing days of the campaign as we're leading up to Election Day. All those thousands of people who have volunteered to go door knocking and to get out there will get recruited by the congressional, the federal office holders, the federal candidates, and the national candidates, presidential campaigns, to do blitzes on lit distribution. Giving you the flyers and putting those in your windshield and your door, and doing door knocking as well. But that still remains, and in the campaigns that I've worked on here in Minnesota, whether it was for Secretary of State, a statewide office, or for a school board race, door knocking really is the cornerstone of those campaigns. And I think in Minnesota, if you don't have a good door knock plan, you're probably not going to win your race. And it's still important to have that face-to-face. And this is one of the things that I hope our precinct caucuses don't go away as archaic as they are. Maybe a hybrid system, but I really enjoy, and I think it's one of the last opportunities that we have to meet our neighbors and to talk with our neighbors. And so I think that remains a really important part of what politics is, as much as we hear about the media and television and so on.
Scott, who is the social media, and I guess I focus mainly on your social media, who are you reaching? We have in this room, of course, a lot of seniors and retired folks, and I'm sure you use a lot of the social media. As I found out a few weeks ago with Wardour, is that his email's now passé. I thought I was real cool using email a lot, and that's no longer very in vogue. But who is the social media reaching by and large? How are millennials, children and grandchildren of the people in this room, how are they being reached, if at all, by social media and with conservative philosophy ideas and conservative political candidates? How are they reaching out and getting to these folks, if they are?
Well, I have to speak from my experience. My experience is writing for a site online, and I regularly write for the Weekly Standard magazine as well when I have something. It's usually Minnesota-based that's of interest for a national readership, like the terrorism trial that went down in federal court in Minneapolis this past May. I've written 3 articles about that case for the Weekly Standard. Our site, I think it's about 100,000 readers a day, and it's an unusual situation because unlike, say, the Star Tribune, where I think many of the people who subscribe or buy the paper are getting it for the sports section, when folks come to Powerline, they're mostly looking for conservative commentary. Each of the 4 of us who contribute to it write about other things of interest to each of us. Personally, I write about music fairly regularly. My colleague John writes about beauty pageants. Steve is really kind of a Renaissance man. So we try to, I would say, have other things of interest, draw in a wider readership. I think we have readers from all over the world who are interested in conservative commentary. John recently appeared on Australian television. He was invited by one of the most prominent conservative commentators down there to appear. That's the heart of our experience. On Twitter, I think it's gone through several generations already. If you're interested in following the news, I think Twitter is the state of the art. Reporters and editors and columnists are all on Twitter. If there's breaking news, Twitter is the place to be. You'll find out what's going on one way or another, either from the pros who are out covering it or witnesses who are there observing it. So it's just a necessity. There is and has been this year, I think, frequently a kind of gang-like quality to addressing issues and controversies that is alienating. You have to follow people who are worth following. But I think I should leave it at that for now and listen to Jorge and see what I can learn on that subject.
Jorge, what about that? And how about in reaching lower income, ethnic voters, people who are part of the Democratic base? Are they as reachable on Twitter and Instagram and all of this social media, or is that where the door knocking and other types of events really have to take place to get people to vote? And oftentimes it's done collectively. For instance, I know, the black churches have traditionally been a forum for getting people to gather together, and actually someone will actually lead them to the polls sometimes for early voting, and we've seen a lot of that. It's different forms of getting people to vote that aren't as social media compliant.
Yeah. Well, on the Twitter thing, and I think Facebook, and even the email, there definitely are days where I long for a real newspaper, and it's been a while since I've seen one. But I read the newspaper every day, every morning, and I usually read 3 or 4 different newspapers, national and from here in Minnesota, print, publications, as well as online newspapers. And but I think that the challenge for all of us as voters and as citizens, because these really are powerful tools. And I think one thing that Donald Trump has demonstrated in this campaign is how powerful these tools can be to really shape. And all you have to do is look at the primary and the way that Donald Trump used Twitter to see the power in this kind of media, where you're limited to these short phrases. But the challenge for us as voters and as citizens is it's like drinking from a fire hose. Just the volume of information, and quite frankly, the volume of garbage that because there's, as powerful as they are, you have to frequently wade through a lot of junk. And I think it's interesting what John said initially, that the most lucrative subject line was the word "hey." And, this is what's called clickbait, is, writing a catchy phrase that will get you to click on a link or to go to a story or to go to a photograph or whatever. You get sucked into all these things that frequently are just distracting. But in terms of, what I think the future is, and I mentioned one of the things earlier is there's an application that's called WhatsApp. Or What's Up is the way people talk about it. And from what I understand, the history of this is that this is a platform that was developed in India by a couple of entrepreneurs. And the reason they developed it is because cell phone text messaging charges were so high. And another thing about, when you talk about new voters, there are a lot of new voters who have highly sophisticated smartphones. They're practically, supercomputers in the palm of their hands, but who never or rarely use them as telephones. And they might be used for video communications, texts and chat and messaging and photographs and so on, but rarely do they get picked up as a phone. And so WhatsApp, the proliferation of WhatsApp around the world is incredible. I'm from Chile. And here in Minnesota, we have a very strong affinity group, Chilenos in Minnesota. And for Chilenos, WhatsApp is vital to remaining in contact with people in Chile, which is on the other hemisphere, on the southern hemisphere. And with WhatsApp, it's, you can send video, photographs, documents, you can make phone calls, you can send messages out to groups. It's got all of the things that are Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and the newspaper and television and the video store, all kind of wrapped up in one of these apps. Now, I think that that's where the future is. And to get to the question that Marshall sort of wrapped up with, which is, what about, you know, those voters that are poor, or people of color, or immigrant communities, other marginalized groups that are not maybe in the mainstream of voters? I think campaigns are really looking hard at apps like WhatsApp, which live on your phone. And frequently people who don't own a computer, maybe never use a computer, but have a phone that's practically a computer in their hands. And right now, you know, the story my brother always tells is about, you know, when he would go to Chile, and when cell phones were emerging, and there was a man on the street in a very sort of bedraggled looking suit selling peaches. And you might look at this man and say, you know, here's a man who's likely in poverty, or likely has a low income, working very hard to make a living, scratch out a living, and he pulls out of his pocket this very sort of state-of-the-art cell phone with a touch screen and the whole thing. And I think that is the future in terms of how campaigns are going to communicate.
Well, I would urge everyone in this room, if they haven't done so, when you get home today or later in the week, talk to your children, but more significantly your grandchildren, and ask them about what we're talking about. See what they say in terms of WhatsApp. And actually, by the time you get home, WhatsApp will probably be passé, and there'll be something else that surpassed that, because the technology is moving so fast. But ask them what they use and how they communicate, because it's really interesting to hear how the younger generation is doing that. Speaking of the younger generation, I saw a poll the other day that says millennials are breaking, according to the poll, 2.5, 3, even 4 to 1 in favor of Clinton over Trump. And that same poll had of millennials, I guess these are people 30 and under, is that millennials? The people that advertisers want, the prime group for advertisers. The poll also showed that millennials lean liberal about 2 to 1 compared to over conservatives, the younger people, which is reflective, I think, of certain things going on in society. But do you find that to be true, Scott? And if so, what do you and your conservative colleagues, what can you and your conservative colleagues do about that? Are we seeing the next generation going to be more liberal? Or is that part of a trend that's always been the case? What's that old saying, you're a liberal when you're young and conservative when you're old?
It was Churchill, I think, who said that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain. Something like that. Marshall, just let me take the liberty of going back to the social media question and on Jorge's comments for just a second, and then remind me what you just asked. But I just want to make sure you understand, you know, Twitter is an online platform. You create an account on it, and I think it was Marshall or Jorge who referred to short phrases on it. You create an account under a screen name or under your name. I have one under my name. And you can communicate with subscribers. Again, you have to build up a readership if that's the way you want to communicate with people, or otherwise you can look for people whose tweets you want to receive. And Jorge referred to drinking out of a fire hose. You know, depending on the number of people whom you sign up to get tweets from, it can be overwhelming. Don't even try to keep up unless you want to make it a full-time job. But there are a lot of news people on it, as I said, and there are a lot of people who are worth following. But the state of the art on Twitter is that a tweet is limited. And I just want to say this for your information. This is the deal. A tweet is limited to 140 characters, which is, you know, a few sentences at best. And it turns out that some people are geniuses in that form. It's really amazing. Some people are even regularly funny in under 140 characters, which blows me away. But so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon all by itself. And Marshall followed up, and Jorge addressed the question of communicating with less privileged people via social media. What about that? One of the things that I found just astounding attending this terrorism trial from May 9th to June 3rd, every day in court in Minneapolis there were 3 young men on trial, and they had been charged with 6 others. The 6 others pleaded guilty before trial. But, you know, none of them were privileged young men. But as Jorge suggested, every one of them seemed to have a cell phone, Every one of them had multiple social media applications. Every one of them was up to the most recent social media application beyond WhatsApp was a set of encrypted applications, which is giving the FBI fits. These guys knew how to communicate with those who inspired them, who'd left Minneapolis to sign up with ISIS in Syria. We're having conversations with their friends in Syria who are encouraging them to come over or do wrong things here in Minneapolis. Just absolutely mind-blowing. I can't remember the name of those applications offhand, but the people who covered the trial, I think, regularly mention them. Some applications that haven't even been mentioned yet, but that are widely used among young people because they are safe from prying eyes. So I just wanted to throw that in for your information for good measure.
Okay, now I'll repeat my question in case you had a brain freeze there, as occasionally I do. Younger people, liberal versus conservative, polls showing 2-3 to 1 voting, favoring Clinton over Trump, maybe even higher than that. But generally, polls saying younger people, those under 30, tend to be liberal, not conservative. Then you talked about Churchill.
I wish Republicans had a good candidate this year. I think a good young candidate like Marco Rubio would make all the difference in the world with appealing to younger voters. I think that, Marshall, what you point out is a crisis. Speaking for myself personally, when I get invited to speak to younger audiences, I always just seek, a level playing field with a liberal counterpart like Jorge. I just want to be able to argue the issues, whether it's public policy or politics, in a forum that gives me an opportunity to speak. I think conservative ideas have evidence to support them and are in the interest of the audiences whom I address, and I love the opportunity to do that. I think that what I find when I speak, especially to high school audiences, even smart young people, or maybe especially smart young people, is that everything they know isn't true. It is just mind-boggling. So I think education is a huge challenge, and that conservatives really need to take advantage of the opportunities in media like online sites to communicate with a younger audience, to seek out a younger audience, and to educate them in the virtues of the United States, American history, the American idea, and the conservatism that embodies all those things.
Scott's referred to a colleague and friend of his, John Hinderaker, a couple of times. Just to put that in context, John is the head of the American Center for the American Experiment, and kind of known as a conservative think tank. That's probably a little bit of an overbroad statement. He might be a worthy speaker to come here at some time and talk about some of his organization's activities, and probably have to balance that with someone from the other side too. Scott referred to a crisis, and I guess one person's crisis is another person's opportunity, right, Jorge? What Scott said, liberal slant, at least of younger people, is a crisis. That's his term, not mine. Do you view it as a crisis, or do you view it as an opportunity on the liberal side?
Well, as it, and certainly those of you in the room here have the benefit of a long hindsight, being able to look back at a wide range of historical events and presidential candidates and the tenor of politics and how it's changed. I'm cautious every time that I think things are going really, really well, because we know how quickly the tide can turn in politics. And one of my concern with young people, with millennials, who today, in this election cycle, may be leaning, very hard to the left, is that can change just as quickly. And that one of the things that I think that social media has fostered is a fickleness. And I think, one of the criticisms that you hear about, from retailers, where, I started out in retail working for a company named Dayton's, which became Dayton-Hudson, which became Dayton-Hudson-Marshall Fields, and I'm not sure what the name of it is this week, right? But my guess is that, you know, a lot of you grew up with Dayton's and the Dayton family, and, you know, there was a loyalty to these brands, to General Electric and Westinghouse and RCA and so on, that I think is, this is not a tradition among young people now. You know, people are shopping on price or novelty, and what I mentioned earlier, clickbait. You know, clever and outrageous to get your attention. My concern is that I see too many young people falling prey to that, and you know, and we're missing some of the more in-depth conversations on issues.
I see some folks are chafing to ask questions or make comments, so I'll probably walk around here and try to get people involved here. So who wants to ask a question or make a comment? And you might have to come over here if that's not too much of a difficulty here, because and give us your name, please, and what you have to say here, Steve.
I'm Steve Anderson. My question is, our legislative process seems to have ground to a complete halt. And that the two sides, I'm very impressed. We had a Republican and a Democrat in the same room, and so far for 50 minutes, it's been very civil. I mean, that's kind of unusual. How did we get to this point, and what do we do to fix it? Because we need to have some civic effort to where we work on things together.
You want to give some credit to the moderator for who I selected to be on the panel? All right, how do we fix the deadlock or the venom, the difficulty getting anything done? All right, fine. Let's keep it short, though. So how about 30 seconds on how we got there, Scott, and 30 seconds on how we fix it, and then we'll give equal time to Jorge and go to the next question. How do we get here, and how do we fix it? 30 seconds.
You know, I don't mean to be offensive, but I would really encourage you to read Federalist number 10. Gridlock and partisan disagreement is built into the system. There's a reason for that. The system is conservative. Most of the ideas that are floating around in the legislature are really, really stupid. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And it's a good thing that they are slowed down and that most of them are prevented from becoming law. And most of those that have become laws are also bad ideas. So I don't oppose gridlock. I think you have to, however you characterized it. That's what came to mind when I heard you ask the question. What's usually characterized as gridlock is characterized as our form of government. Three branches that deter each other in the Federalist Papers. And I think it's a good system. I support it. I regret the assertion of executive power over against the other branches in the Obama administration, and I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Let's take a little bit of a flip side of that, or not the flip side, but another subcategory of what Steve asked about. How about the harshness and lack of civility that's characterizing politics these days? How do we get there, and how do we fix that if it needs fixing?
Well, I think the issue of civility definitely needs fixing, because I think when we dispose of respect for each other, then I think we're cooked. But you know, to answer the question in terms of, you know, the gridlock and the, you know, the intransigence that we see both in national and state politics, I think, you know, and there's these proposals are floating around out there, but 2-year terms for legislators and for Congress people, I think feeds this problem. And the reason, certainly part of the reason why John and I can sit here at this table is that neither of us are running for re-election. And my guess is that if we had to count votes on November 8th, the tenor might be very different.
The question of civility, if I could encourage you to read one book, and this will sound like a partisan comment, I don't mean it to be, but the Wall Street Journal columnist and member of the editorial board, Kimberly Strassel, has a new book out called The Intimidation Game. And it talks about the institutionalization of partisan beatdowns by the Democratic Party that's really become a form of suppressing dissent. Her book is a 400-page set of case studies in how it works. the most egregious of which occurred next door in Wisconsin. I'm not sure you ever read about it, under the hand of a county prosecutor who subpoenaed a bunch of activist leaders in midnight raids and emptied their house of otherwise private papers to discourage the exercise of their freedoms. So that's the intimidation game by Kim Strassel, and I think it is the true direction in which we're headed, and I would encourage you to take a look at that book or read about it online.
Scott's given us a lot of reading material here. We have the 2-volume work on Reagan, we have the Federalist Papers, and now we have this 400-page book by Kim Strassel. Question and name, please.
Doug Haddon. I would suggest, too, you might want to look back at the Watergate papers. But let me get to a question that both of you, I think, should be dealing with here, and that is voting. On the right, you have voter suppression, active in the red states, active the minute the Voter Rights Act was modified by right-wing Supreme Court. And on the left, we're working to try and get voters out, making new voters from new citizens. You know, why do we have that disparity? Why do we have one party making a partisan issue of voting when we all should have the right to vote?
I thought you were going to get into voter fraud issues too, so I'll take that up. I'll start with you, Jorge. There's been some intimations, more than intimations, that the election is rigged. Well, Trump has used that phrase, and there's voter fraud going on, and there ought to be vigilante poll watchers and those kind of things. I know it is, and I know you'll have a chance. He'll have a chance to answer that. But you want to address that, and then address his question about voter suppression and if that's a trend that we're seeing here.
Well, I'm not giving you any reading assignments, but certainly the homework that I would give you is vote on November 8th. I think that's still important. And but to respond to the question, you know, to me, I'm still puzzled by these strategies, whether they're by the political parties in terms of voter suppression, because I really do think that is a place where politics should be hands off. Now, you do everything you can zealously to get voters to vote for your person, for your candidate, for your party, for your ideology. But don't mess with creating barriers for people to get to the polls. And so this nonsense about IDs and about having picture IDs and this nonsense about voter fraud and this nonsense about our elections in the United States being rigged right now, you know, I don't think we should be going there as a tactic to win elections.
Dan, if I can just paraphrase your question, I think you indicated, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you felt that the right-wing forces have made a number of efforts at voter suppression. Is that right? Pardon?
It's fact.
Okay, fine. All right. Now we're going to let Scott address that issue.
Well, I think that what's described by folks like Doug as voter suppression is our laws that require some kind of identification to make sure that only legal voters vote. And I support those efforts. I think it's a good idea to restrict the franchise to legal voters, and that efforts to do that should be supported. Democrats, you know, to respond in the same spirit that Doug asked this question, it seems from the other perspective, it seems to me that, well, without meaning to offend anybody, Democrats protect illegal voters like they're a core constituency, and that you can understand a lot about the BS about voter suppression if you look at it with that perspective.
I think we probably have a chance for one more comment or question or a little bit of both here before I'm sorry, I have to repeat that. We have an opportunity here for one more comment or a question before we wrap it up at 10 o'clock. So does anyone want to weigh in with anything else here or any observations? Yes, sir. Come on up to the front here. Okay, Roger, let it rip. Turn around so the camera can see you.
Yeah, I have a question for the gentleman right here. Why don't you get decent candidates that believe in global warming to run for president?
Is that is the aversion or lack of acceptance of the concept of global warming, Scott, is that being stuck to the conservatives these days in a way that's going to hurt them with liberals and not just liberals, millennials and other folks? Is this a kind of a phrase that's going to really haunt the conservatives for a while?
Well, I hope not. The argument is over so-called anthropogenic global warming. Did I just turn this off? Sorry about that. I just turned it off. The argument is really about so-called anthropogenic global warming and what, if any, contribution man makes to alleged global warming, and it butts up against what I perceive to be the fact that over the past 15 years, on average, there has been no net global warming, and that the models none of the models that predict global warming can be brought into conformity with the historical record. So there are various adjustments that have to be made. My colleague Steve Hayward on Powerline regularly addresses these issues. He puts out an annual almanac of leading environmental indicators. He writes a lot about it on Powerline. I'd encourage you to take a look at some perspective other than one that accepts the line on this as dogma.
I don't necessarily want to ask you about global warming, Jorge, but is that an issue, and certain other related issues, science issues and rejection of science-related issues, is that an issue that has resonance with the Democratic base as a vote gathering and vote turnout technique?
Well, what's interesting is that this global warming issue has not been an issue in this campaign. It really has not been mentioned at all. And so it's interesting to hear this. I mean, certainly it has been an issue, and it has been one of the dividing lines between the left and the right politically, for better or worse. But what is interesting to me is that so many of the issues that I think have been centerpieces in very recent elections are getting almost no airtime in the campaign in 2016.
All right, we're just about ready to wrap up here, but I'd like to thank both of our participants, Scott Johnson and Jorge Saavedra.